Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Sloda, and I am here with my co-author and co-host, the supremely supercalifragilisticexpiala expletive deleted,
Trent Hergenrader.
And we're thrilled to have you here for today's discussion about Chapter 3, Theory to Practice, in which we connect the educational psychology and philosophy concepts described in Chapter 2 with foundational principles of instructional design. But rather than retread the same territory we covered in the text, we're going to focus this conversation on our respective journeys to deciding that inquiry-based instruction and world modeling were the right fit for us. Trent, why don't you give us a glimpse into the trials and tribulations that most shaped the way you think about pedagogical and assessment design, especially as someone coming at this from a humanities perspective?
Sure. The funny thing is, I feel like I just did this because I did, because we thought we were recording the episode, did the whole thing, and I had actually failed to hit record. So now I'm paying my penance for that. Anyway, yeah, so I did K through 12 in Green Bay public schools in Green Bay, Wisconsin, mostly in the 1980s. I graduated in 1992, and then I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, very large state university, 45,000 students, 10,000 students in my incoming freshman class. I graduated there in 1996. I majored in English, although I took a bunch of philosophy and took a bunch of history. Could have triple majored if I had played my cards right, and then my earning potential would have exploded. But, I had a really good, I really enjoyed my undergraduate years where I had not enjoyed my K through 12. But one of the things that's funny is I look back and I don't remember all that much of classes from undergrad. I kind of remember some concepts. The format for those classes in the humanities was almost always, you have two exams, two midterms and a final. These were usually short answer. So you'd get they'd give you a list of 5 questions the week before, and you'd have to answer, say, 3 of them or something like that within a time period, or you would write 2 midterm papers or a combination of those, and then either some sort of final exam that was similar in structure or a final paper. And that was pretty much for all my history, philosophy, English, and any other classes that I took that were in the humanities. In the social sciences, I took a little sociology, a little anthropology, and those tended to be more multiple choice type questions and exams. And those, in most of my undergraduate classes, would have somewhere between 300 students, somewhere in that range, broken out with TAs who would take 20 students at a time for individual discussion sections. And that was the way that I experienced my undergrad. And the thing that's funny is I enjoyed lectures on topics that I was interested in. So the learning was more or less you go to lectures 3 times a week or twice a week. You do some readings, or often don't do the readings that you're supposed to do. And then at the end of the day, that was the class. And my attention was directly related to my level of interest in the classes. So if I was not interested in that particular class, then I'd totally zone out. And I was saying too before that there's 2 student papers at University of Wisconsin. You'd grab a copy of each, do the crossword or play hangman in the back of the room, even though we didn't have cell phones. So it's not that just because we didn't have technology in the classroom, we were not always paying attention. And I did my best to avoid math and science labs because I was not interested in those, although I think I probably could have benefited from them. And I would say my grade school, K through 12 education was pretty similar to that. It was very much rote learning, very much sit in your seats, listen to the teacher talk, do your worksheets, and then get out of there. So not a lot of innovative pedagogy happening in Green Bay, Wisconsin in the 1980s, which probably was why I did not like school all that much. But what was your experience, Steve?
It's quite similar, especially with respect to higher ed. So undergrad, I think everyone who's been to a large R1 or Research 1 university probably has that kind of experience where it's a one-to-many situation. You have the lecturer at the front who might be a professor, might be an adjunct, might be a TA in some cases. My largest class I ever had was a chemistry course. It was the freshman first year chemistry course for all the science majors. So my undergraduate degree is in molecular cell biology and genetic engineering. My coursework, therefore, was almost entirely this large lecture-based stuff. Like there were all the pre-med students, all the people going into engineering. We were all shuffled into more or less the same courses. And as a result, the chemistry course had 1,500 people in it divided across multiple sections. The quality of your experience was almost entirely determined by the lecturer that you had. Again, some of these people were really dedicated to their lecturing jobs. Some of them were doing this as an afterthought or just because they needed a graduate assistantship to be able to pay their way through college. And usually, like you were describing with the humanities, you'd have breakout sessions or discussion sections that would usually be led by a TA and then have maybe 20 to 25 people in them, especially in lab situations where there's a limited number of lab benches. You'd have to have this sort of artificial cap on the number of people that were in there, but it was always more than I think one person should be teaching. And for the vast majority of the time, we were taking multiple choice tests. There were some open-ended questions or short answer questions, but very rarely were we being assessed on our actual ability to apply what we were learning. It was almost universally, here's the textbook, here's the lecture, now regurgitate it for me on a test. And if you pass the test, you get the check mark and can move on to the next section. I struggled a lot with this. I think I had mentioned previously, and certainly I mentioned it in the book, but I grew up in a rural part of New England. And as a result, my graduating class in high school was only 82 people. To go from that to an R1 university with 35,000 students, where I was just a number, nobody cared who I was or what I had done, that was quite a challenge. And I think one of the reasons I succeeded in K-12, whereas in college I struggled a lot more, was because of the amount of individual attention I had gotten from my teachers in K-12 relative to the amount of attention I got from my professors when I was in college. And, as you and I know, having been faculty now, the vast majority of time you spend as a faculty member is not thinking about how you're going to teach. In fact, teaching is almost, at least at large universities, secondary to your research, because research is what's keeping the lights on for the university. And frankly, that's kind of the mission of academia, is to discover new medications, find out these important principles of physics, or understand something about society or the community as a whole. Most of the faculty who were teaching these classes, that was their primary interest or their primary job. It was not to show up to these lectures and then provide the most comprehensive education possible. It was just something they did because they were contractually obligated. That's not to say that every professor was bad or that there weren't some who really were trying to innovate, but for the most part, even if your schedule is 40, 40, 20 with your teaching and your research responsibilities followed by service, you are basically forced into the situation where you're competing with your own schedule all the time to find time to do the things that you need to do to get through the day. So teaching was not a huge priority for a lot of our colleagues or a lot of the people we had as professors. That really showed in the kind of instruction we got. It was almost all didactic, lecture driven, very little hands on, very little inquiry driven. And it makes sense. Like, I was always sympathetic to the instructors of these courses who were, I think, good teachers, but that were overwhelmed by the number of students that they had to attend to. And just to give an example here, for those of you who haven't taught that kind of course before, when I would teach learning theory at the University of Connecticut, I would have about 120 or more students in that lecture at a time. And I was working with a 4-4 teaching load. So one of the 4 classes I was teaching every fall and spring would be a 120-person lecture. I did not have multiple TAs for that course. So everything that I assigned, I needed to read. And even if I only did one term paper, so for instance, a philosophy of education or a philosophy statement, let's say that it's an 8-page paper, but we'll say it's 4 just to account for double spacing. That means that I'm multiplying every assignment by 4 pages by the number of people in that class. So just for the philosophy statement for that one lecture, I'm reading upwards of 800 pages to be able to get through the entire class's worth of students. And in order to give meaningful feedback, I'd need to do a close reading. So close reading, upwards of 800 pages worth of content for one assignment, was just so much that I couldn't do justice to the kind of teaching I wanted to do. And then even if I offloaded a lot of that responsibility to a TA or to maybe 2 TAs, I still had to go and cross-check everything they were doing because they weren't the experts in the room. They were graduate students who were trying to learn this stuff for themselves. Some of them had not even come through the pipeline for educational psychology or learning theory. They were students who were from completely different disciplines within the School of Education. So I was having to get my hands on all of these different parts of the coursework that I was assigning. You had mentioned that often students didn't read the textbook. I found that to be true. Why would you? It's a dry text that often feels very decontextualized. And as a result, I was trying to attend to the needs of hundreds of people a year while only having so much time to dedicate. And as I mentioned in the last episode, Chris Hayes's book, The Siren's Call, which is all about the attention economy, even before COVID had happened, we were fighting tooth and nail to get students to show up to class, to participate, to meaningfully contribute to any group work that we were doing. We're just competing as faculty against all of these different tools, all of these different apps, all of these different priorities that our learners had. what are the odds I'm going to be able to break through versus a video game or versus a Reddit post or versus Twitter or Facebook or TikTok or
Hmm.
name your app of choice, right? So we have all of these competing priorities. We have all of these competing elements of distraction in the classroom. What we end up with is this mostly ineffectual method that was created for the purposes of efficiency. And that efficiency has ended up costing us the hands-on one-on-one time that we would have otherwise had with students, which means that the quality of the learning that's happening is just not that good. And I think
Hmm.
that's reflected across most large universities. There are, of course, outliers. There are smaller universities. There are community colleges where the dynamics are a little bit different. But for a large R1, you basically exist in that space to make money for the university so that it can sustain itself, knowing that the state legislature has cut the budget for the universities across the board, that the grants that we are acquiring for our research, 50% of that money is going right back into the infrastructure of the university. So all of these different facets of what makes higher education function as an institution are actually at odds with doing good teaching. And
Hmm.
I think that was kind of my takeaway that whether you're in the humanities like you're describing or you're in the quote unquote hard sciences like I was, the same mechanisms existed for teaching and learning, and often those mechanisms were outdated and frankly inadequate for the kinds of things we needed our students to be going out into the world and doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's
Talk
what,
a little bit about that from your perspective in terms of how you think education was organized. Like, what was the organizing principle for those humanities classes?
Yeah, it was just as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, I really, so my K through 12, they really emphasized math and science because they wanted everyone to become an engineer or go into the military. I was a writer, I was writing fiction all the time, thinker, those kind of things, and that wasn't valued sort of at all. And I kind of developed this relationship with coursework that it's like, oh, I got to figure out how to, maximum efficiency. How can I do as little work as possible to be able to get out of here, right? Like to get out of each grade, to be able to, whatever. I screwed around in class, got in trouble a lot in K through 12. And it took me a good year and a half being at university before realizing, hey, this is my education. This is for me. And this whole game of like, you're going to assign the reading and I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to pretend that I did and write a paper that assumes that I, whatever. That's how I thought it was supposed to work, right? And I think that that has only increased over time. But I think overall, like you'd said before, it's the efficiency. When you've got that many students and you just, you're going to stand up, and in my case, you're going to give a lecture on, some book by James Joyce or whatever, right? And it's like, okay, write the notes down, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about whether you paid attention in class. I was actually just talking, I've got a 16-year-old, and I was just talking about him. He's going through finals right now, and his English language arts final is all multiple choice, and that's just heart wrenching for me. They did have another part, but I believe it's a state administered test. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just like, okay, well, if you are going to ask, the real goal for literature is how are you interpreting this? What are all these human questions? What are these characters' motivations? How do you feel about the choices that they made? And that really becomes devalued when you just break it down into a four. Somebody wrote a multiple choice question where one of the answers is supposed to be better than the others, and it doesn't matter what you personally got out of it. It's like such an impoverished way of looking at literature, or understanding history, or any of those things. But in order to actually get how much did you learn, you need to have some sort of written output or a conversation or something like that that just does not scale up to hundreds and hundreds of students. Like you said, you're reading a novel's worth of freshman or undergraduate writing is not it's not a wonderful use of your time. But it just goes back to this point that okay, yeah, one of the things I think I like to sort of like think about or at least talk about are why are we doing any of this, right? I mean, like it's we are born at a certain age, we've got compulsory education, you go to kindergarten or even if you're homeschooled, it's required you go through the classes, right? And then students that are college bound then kind of pick a degree based largely on the career that they think they want to do or whatever they want to do for their vocation. And everything sort of follows from that. And we're so far removed as to the reasons why we go to school. What is it that we are trying to learn? How do we prove that we've learned something? These are
Mhm.
all questions that seem secondary to the business of education, of what are the metrics, what are the numbers, all of those kinds of questions. And I think students feel that. All students feel that. Like I said, I was thinking this is a game. I got to figure out how to play this game so I can do the things that I actually want to do. And it only got to the point where I was realizing it was for me when I was taking classes that I was interested in, and finding linkages between them, and all those kinds of questions. But it took a long time, and it just kind of makes you wonder, why is that? Why is it that our education system is set up in that way, that the goal is hard to articulate? Why are we doing this? To be better people somehow? And I think, when we look back at the way that the educational system was set up, well, I mean, why don't you talk about that? How is the U.S. education system? How did we get here?
Yeah, so in chapter two, we do dive into this a little bit, and then we return to it somewhat in chapter three with respect to the various kinds of philosophies you can apply to the development of an education system. Importantly, the way we do it in the United States and the history of education here is not universal across all countries for all time. Education looked very different in different places. It still does. The underlying goals for education look quite different in different areas. Here, the compulsory education system that we now have was originally rooted in puritanical structures, largely driven by a desire to have young people become godly citizens who would know how to contribute to their communities effectively. So there was this orientation toward what I think we would now call some kind of self-actualization, that they were meant to be thinking, they'd be taking these languages to make them more quote unquote worldly, to make them understand these deeper concepts or go into fields like law or politics. And that component, that element of education did not sustain itself through the Industrial Revolution. So as you reach the early 1900s or even the late 1800s, you start to see this transition away from this one room schoolhouse model where you'd have a teacher working with some number of students. You'd have multiple age groups in the same space. They would often be working on the same kinds of content together, regardless of what their age was or what their skills differentiation was. That migrated toward this efficiency driven system because at the time you needed to create a mass of employees who would be able to go work in factories and not lose their limbs in the machinery, right? You wanted to be
Yeah.
able to have these people know enough that both they could read the Bible, which was an important component here, as well as functionally do the job, which then converted education away from this sort of self-actualization toward job training. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have
Mm-hmm.
this work orientation or this economic orientation of education that has sort of persisted since the early 20th century. And this isn't to say every philosopher of education believes in this. I think there are plenty of examples, and we delineate them in the book, that basically argued for organizing education in some different way. But frankly, it was just easier to stick everybody into a
Yeah.
classroom based on their age, which is not the most interesting thing that those students have in common or separately. And rather than focus on what is their skill level or their ability level at a given task, we started to think through, can you check all the boxes to successfully get through this hoop to go do the thing we actually want you to do, which is to participate in the economy? It's not to say that there isn't utility there or that you might not want vocational training in a variety of capacities, but for that to be the central organizing principle of education ultimately undermines the way we do education or what
Mm-hmm.
it means to be a
Mm-hmm.
learner. And you and I have talked at length previously about what does it mean to be a learner? What does it mean to learn? What does it mean to instruct? And I think for somebody who exists in that ecosystem that is driven by economics as opposed towards self-actualization, as opposed to the democratization of knowledge, you ultimately end up in a place where you just repeatedly devalue all the things that don't directly contribute to a capitalist understanding of what it is to be quote unquote successful.
Right.
So it becomes a process by which, an assembly line by which we educate students, and I'm using education in air quotes here, we educate them to do the job to make the economy function. And now we see the end result of that, which is not only K-12 being oriented toward these quantitative metrics of can you read and write and do math successfully, but also higher education gravitating toward that, where often you'll have students that are taking these specific gen ed courses that they have no understanding of how or why they ended up there. And it
Right.
just becomes a checkbox for them to say, yeah, I did the thing that the state told me I had to do or that the university told me I had to do. I don't really have a purpose to be here other than that. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been when you interview or ask students about like why are they taking the classes that you're teaching? Because I know you work with a lot of engineers. So
Right. Right.
what does creative writing mean to them, or what do the humanities mean to those folks?
Yeah, so the classes, I mean, we've got an intro to creative writing class, which is where I meet most of the people who have no real interest in, they're trying to get their art, what we call it at my university, an artistic perspective. And generally, they just want to get out of there with their artistic credit, right? It's creative writing. They tend to think, oh, it's going to be easy. They don't have a lot of value in it. even more so, I help organize and I teach a unit in a hundred and up to 150 students, 120, 150 students. That is a interdisciplinary liberal arts class in which I we take a theme. Last year's theme was misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. This year's theme is going to be economic inequality. And then I've got some volunteers from 5 different disciplines who come in and each teach a 2-week unit about what would an anthropologist or sociologist say about misinformation? What does a philosopher say about misinformation, right? How do we use these
Mhm,
different
mhm.
tools? And that is a class that is also a gen ed, and it's also the reason why it's large is because the university has decided we need to process our STEM students a little bit faster, get them their general education credits a little bit faster. So why not throw more of them into a very large lecture hall? But 70 to 80% of the students in that class are STEM majors. They're either engineering of some sort or computer science of some sort. And I ask in the beginning of the semester, number one, none of them choose to take that class. Their advisors put them in that class, and they take it because they need to get it's a gen ed class, and it helps get the gen ed, I think it's an ethical perspective or something like that, out of the way. But the thing that's funny is when I've asked in like a Google form, anonymous Google form, they say things like, "Oh, well, we've got to take these classes so the university can charge us more tuition," right? Like we've got these. They have no idea that there is a state education department that oversees, all of the schooling or whatever. Sometimes they think, oh, well, vaguely it's to be a better person or something along those lines. And for most of them, I think they would opt out. If they could, they would opt out. And the thing that's funny is we do have vocational schools in which you don't have to take, if you want to be a mechanic or something like that, you don't need to take liberal arts. And I start off this particular class with some readings that were from a guy named Alexander Micklejohn, who was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and he set up a interdisciplinary school at the university in which I took some classes, and this is where I first learned about him. And it really is sort of the impetus for me to have designed this particular class as well. But it talks about why do we have the liberal arts at all? And it's basically this idea that we want people to come out as better citizens. Like you said, going into politics. He talks a lot about how theology used to be one of the driving things that isn't so much at the
Mhm.
beginning of the 20th century. But more or less, he says if you want to do vocational school, that's great. Go do that, but don't turn the university into vocational learning, right there. And this was back in the early 1900s, 1915 to 1918 is when most of these essays were published. And it's funny because the students, when I have them read it, first of all, they don't like them very much because they're dry and they're sort of an academic language. But on the other hand, it's like they've never thought about why they would be taking liberal arts classes. And some of them, it's eye-opening. And it's like, oh, maybe there is more to this education thing and, connecting dots between different disciplines. But, a good chunk of them are like, I don't care. That's 100 years old. The world has moved on. I should just take engineering classes. And it's really hard, it's funny because it would be interesting to do sort of a before and after to see how many change their minds over the course of the semester. And unfortunately, I think a lot of them don't. If they come in with a really not a great attitude towards their gen ed requirements, then it's really hard to turn that around. But yeah, I mean that's kind of the experience, and of course for me, I feel very deeply that they should be thinking about ethics and then bringing their own experiences to their education because again, it took me a while to figure that out, and everything became so much more gratifying once I figured out that I was the focus of my
Mhm.
education rather than some sort of external thing. So trying to get that across to students that even if you're in the sciences, even if you're in STEM fields or whatever, and you're coming to college to get a degree, to get a job, take some time and take these other kinds of classes seriously, and you'll learn more about yourself and what you can contribute to society overall and things like that. And again, it's something that I'm selling, and not everybody is buying it. And I wish that you could have a different conversation, right? But like you'd said, everyone's coming from a different place. They've had a different background. They arrive on campus. I certainly exited in 1996 a very different person than when I walked in 1992. So you can't get too frustrated. Maybe some of them will see over the long haul that these classes have some worth. But I think too, it's one of the things like you'd said. There are people who are really into their research and they don't care about teaching. And if you are a Dickens scholar and you're that's what you want to do and the students aren't interested in it, I can see how the whole thing becomes very frustrating on both sides. You're not going to put any time into your teaching. They're going to put in the go through the motions for the class, and it just is sort of like a negative feedback loop. And the tragedy too is that college is so expensive, right? Shouldn't you be
Mhm.
getting as much out of every single credit as you possibly can? But it's just not set up. It's just not set up that way. And then so many instructors are not well equipped to change with the times, to adapt their teaching to the different classes that they may be teaching or the different students that they may be teaching because they didn't get the training when they were in graduate school. Like if I was
Hmm.
lucky enough to have gotten some teaching pedagogy, which then I expanded and chose to follow into greater pedagogy when I got into games and learning. But, if you're in history, they don't have any intro to history, how to teach history. You just become a TA, you get thrown into a class, and you just kind of you just replicate what you were taught as, right? And again, it's that big lecture kind of thing that I think a lot of academics like. Like I like lectures. I listen to a lot of the great courses. If you're familiar with those, they're just lectures. I love them, but I'm an academic, and most of my students are not. So, why would they? And then they would not choose to listen to lectures. They would probably choose to do just about anything else. So yeah, it's an interesting question because if you really value it, and I'm assuming if you're listening to this podcast and reading the book that you are interested in good education, then the question becomes, given the constraints in which we are working in and living in,
Hmm.
how do we do it as best as we can to energize and motivate and have the light bulb come on for as many students as we possibly can, right? There's always going to be a percentage that won't pick up the phone no matter what no matter what you're doing. But we really got to think about, okay, well, how can we reach or excite most of the students? And I think that that's where it comes back around to having those examples in which they can see them applying it in their life outside of the university, outside of the classroom. Why does it make sense for them? And that's something that I think conscientious educators need to be thinking about, regardless of the class that they're teaching, and regardless of who may be in front of them at any given moment. Is just thinking about, this is for this. All of this is for the student. It's not for me. It's not for their employer. It's for that person who is sitting in the room. And I think that that's something that we need to be thinking about, like literally every time we walk into the classroom.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because this speaks to how we opened chapter three, this idea of not only are there these competing philosophies of why education exists to begin with, but there's also these competing ideas of where should we be putting our time and attention. And I would argue that it should be on transferability. Like that's the main reason why we highlight transfer in the chapter. It's the main reason why I opine on it all the time when I give presentations or run workshops about education. What else is there for education if not to help people understand how to apply the knowledge and skills they're developing in a classroom somewhere else that isn't the classroom? And that may seem like it's at odds with this notion that education doesn't need to be about vocational training or that it doesn't need to be focused on some specific work-related task. But the truth of the matter is, you want people to go out into the world and recognize when the stuff they learned in class becomes relevant, because there are going to be a
Yeah.
number of instances where there are these ill-defined problems put before them that they're going to need that information to resolve. This was always a really hard sell, as you were saying, not just to undergraduate students, but to my high school students when I was still teaching high school bio. And it really, understandably, is difficult for them to see themselves in a situation where they're going to apply cell biology. They're 15 years
Mm-hmm.
old.
Mm-hmm.
What do they need to know it for? And I always struggled to give them a satisfying answer to that question because saying, well, someday maybe you'll want to be a scientist, or maybe someday you'll go to the doctor and the doctor needs to be able to explain something to you about your body. And that's not really a great answer to somebody whose knowledge and experience base is relatively impoverished or limited, where they haven't yet had a lot of experiences where those things were true, or they haven't
Mm-hmm.
had the experience of recognizing how to synthesize what they're learning in one discipline in another or with another. And we touched on this previously, but schools are not typically organized as interdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary. They're largely siloed such that every student is going from their chemistry class to their English class to their history class to,
Yeah.
insert subject matter here. And no one is pulling those threads together to form the tapestry of what it is to have a well-rounded identity. They're
Mm-hmm.
often just being told, memorize these dates, memorize these names, memorize these words. None of that makes a lot of sense until you have the life experience that demonstrates that that information is useful. And I think all the time about the main criticism of K through 12 education and even higher ed being like, when am I ever going to use fractions in real life? When am I going to use
Right.
gym in real life? Right? Like, and it's not to say those things aren't important or valuable. It's just that school has this as a result of being organized around efficiency and workplace training. School has this effect of deprioritizing a lot of these ideas for students because there is no implicit application of that information in a way that is sensible to a 15-year-old or a 19-year-old.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would argue even a lot of adults don't really have a good understanding of why they learned what they did. You hear this criticism a lot when older folks are examining the curriculum that is in place now. So, for example, the way math is taught now is not the same way that you and
Right,
I were taught math. And the criticism lobbed by parents is, well, why don't they just do it the way I did it? I understand that. And it's like, well, there are actual reasons why you would want to change the way a thing is taught, not least of all because, as with the next generation science standards, the goal is to do a better job of aligning the learning objective with the activity objective. But that's not always obvious to the learner
right,
or to their
right,
parent. And unless you are skilled or at least have some expertise in the realm of education, you won't necessarily even be able to recognize the difference between a learning objective that was written in the 1980s and a learning objective that's written in 2025. It all just kind of looks the same,
right,
or it looks like they did something that didn't need to be done. Like the
right.
old method was just as
It's just
effective.
as fun.
Why'd you
Yeah,
change it? And
right.
this is kind of why we wanted to highlight for those of you listening or those of you who have read the book that there is a method to the madness here, and that educational design can and should be done intentionally. It shouldn't be incidental to the economic structure that drives education to be the way that it is in a hyper-capitalist environment. There are other ways of doing this that are
Right.
more effective, and there are good reasons to do it those different ways.
Yep.
We're just operating in an ecosystem that isn't necessarily organized around those principles as opposed to the other kinds of things that incentivize certain behaviors in higher ed or K-12.
Right. I think it's what's crazy too is the more I've learned, and I mean, I know a fraction because this is way more your world than mine. It's just crazy that the way that we've set things up, and it's specifically for me, the whole you march through these grades based on your date of birth is just madness, right? So I see this in my own classes. The hardest thing to deal with is the variety of skill levels within a given class. So I'll have 20
Hmm.
students in a creative writing class. 4 or 5 are excellent writers, right? And 4 or 5 are like semi-literate. It's almost like English is not their first language, even though it is. And it's like, well, how do I construct any kind of lesson plan that attends to both of them, right? And it's like, and again, it's because of the forces in the university that we cannot have sort of more rigorous prerequisites. And even so, some of the students can fulfill the prerequisites, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't still wind up with these mass disparities. Whereas if you were
Hmm.
doing it purely based on, well, we're going to do some assessment early on and figure out what level you're at, and we're going to put people at the same level together. That makes so much more sense, right? Like it doesn't
Hmm.
matter if you've got an eighth grader sitting next to a 10th grader, right? If they're at the same level, they're going to be able to sort of learn more from each other, teach each other more, right? Like all those kind of
Hmm.
things. When you get into these situations where, the differences between them are so extreme. And that's why we have things at university level like prerequisites, because you're trying to say, okay, you need to have at least gotten some of the basics before you can move on to some of these other more advanced topics. But yeah, in K through 12, like if they would have taken the students who were the most interested in writing and the least interested in math and taught a class math for people who aren't that interested in math, I probably would have been way more successful than that at math, right?
Hmm.
Than what I was. And the other, I mean, this is a little anecdote too, that in first grade, I was listening. I was in a split class between first and second graders. And in first grade, I was sitting and listening to the reading and language section of the second graders. And I would raise my hand and answer questions for them, even though I was in my, I was only in the first, I was supposed to be doing some other kind of work or whatever. So they said, oh, what we'll do is we'll have him do second grade reading. So when I was in second grade, I was doing third grade reading. When I was in third grade, I was
Hmm.
doing fourth grade reading, right? And then third grade, this is so crazy. This is the kind of thing like people not really thinking this through. They said, okay, the times were switched where the fourth graders did reading in the afternoon and the third graders did reading in the morning, right? So their solution was to have me sit in the hall with a math textbook and teach myself math in the morning. And then in the afternoon, I would go to the fourth grade classrooms and do the fourth grade English. Now, this is why I am completely convinced. Third grade is actually also sometimes when you start learning, at least back then, some fairly fundamental,
Hmm.
mathematical concepts, multiplication, division, or whatever. And I had to teach myself that out of a textbook. Now, spoiler, I did not do a great job of that teaching myself, right? And it's like, oh, well, looking back, that's sheer madness, right? Like, why would anybody think that that was a good idea? But it's like that's a classic case of me sitting with nothing but a textbook, decontextualized mathematics, whatever, and it was a horrible, horrible failure, right? And that's where to this day I'm terrible with math. I think it was because of that. Whereas if they would have just said, "Hey, we're gonna, lump people," if I was working in third grade, if I was working at a sixth grade level, put me in a room with people who are working at that level rather than our age groups. It just makes no sense whatsoever. Yet we persist with this, right? We persist because we've got certain blocks of time, we've got certain standards that we, have to meet, certain criteria from the Department of Education, all these kind of things. And instead of just sort of recognizing that it is fundamentally flawed, it has been from the beginning, we just keep doubling down on it. And it's head scratching. I mean, it's obvious that the reason why is because there's so many vested interests in keeping education the way that it is. It is 100% not that it is the best way of doing things. It is absolutely not the best way of doing things. It's just the way that we've inherited, and people are very liable to be like, oh, if this is the way I went through it, then there must be a reason for it, right? And it must be good and it must be right. And it's almost the exact opposite, right? It's like, no, 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 no. If we could redo all of this, we would do it very, very differently, knowing what we know now.
No, that's really interesting. So, a couple things. First, I did not know that about you, and I find that to be a fascinating anecdote about your life that I think explain, like, to your point, it kind of does explain why you would struggle with math or science and gravitate away from it. And this is reflected in a lot of the research that's been done on literacy rates, where the ability to read by the time you get to third grade is actually pretty predictive of how
Yep.
successful you're going to be by the time you graduate high school or college. It's even predictive in many cases of whether or not you will end up in prison at some point, which is pretty horrifying to think
Yeah.
about, that
Yeah.
those two things are at least correlated, if not causally related. The other element of this is, and as I said, I don't think we've ever talked about this before, but I had the same thing happen, but from the other angle, sort of the opposite positioning. So I was born late in the year. My birthday is late in the fall. So I was very young compared to the people I was in school with. I had gone to preschool and kindergarten, and everyone was a year older than me. I ended up being held back a year in first grade, not because the school demanded it or because I couldn't do the work, but because my parents demanded it of the school for fear of what would happen
Yeah.
if everyone went through puberty before I did. So there was this real concern about the social elements of what was happening in school, irrespective of my academic ability, which was fine. So the school was trying to keep me grade locked with everybody else in the same age band that I was in, as opposed to thinking about what would happen if we put this student in a place where they could have with multiple different age bands, or if we had a
Hmm.
situation where they could be learning with multiple different kinds of people simultaneously. And so what ended up happening, the sort of compromise, was they held me back, but I was put into my own track within the first grade classroom. So I was in a room with like 20 or 25 other kids who were
Hmm.
now the same age as me. Actually, I ended up on the opposite side where I was now older than a lot of the people I was with. And as a result, I had special projects all the time. I
Yeah.
got to do puppet shows. I got to work on dioramas. I got to do all this stuff that is associated with gifted and talented programs, or what we would now say is twice exceptionality, where you have somebody who is neurodivergent but also very gifted in the context of school. I was working on all of those projects independently within the same space as all these other people who were doing first grade math and
Yep.
reading.
Yep.
And the consequence was that it was cumulative, where now I go to second grade, but I'm actually operating at a third or fourth grade level relative to everybody else who's just starting at the second grade level. So it kind of was this accelerationist approach to my own education that resulted in me getting my own personal gifted and talented program. And eventually I got sort of shuffled into to the extent that there was sort of a mainline gifted and talented program. But when I was with my fellow students, they were doing their reading out of the little reading booklet. I was working on a board game to explain a concept that I had
Yeah.
learned about, right?
Yeah.
So I'm getting to do this project-based, problem-based, anchored instruction that is actually quite good for learning. And that made me like school more because I was uniquely positioned, because my parents, quote unquote, broke the rules and held me back in
Yeah.
first grade.
Yeah. That's
And it
great.
actually became so problematic by the time I got to fourth grade that the school wanted to skip me ahead to sixth grade. And my parents were like, no, that actually would undo everything we were trying
Yeah.
to prevent, right? So I ended up continuing all the way through middle school, kind of operating on my own personalized track that the school was kind of forced to create by virtue of my parents saying, hey, you need to do something for our child who is obviously ahead in terms of the academic productivity you're looking for, but would be going through puberty after everybody else.
Right.
And
Right. Right.
so that in and of itself is an interesting parallel to the track you're describing for
Yeah.
yourself, where you're self-teaching multiplication and division in the hallway, whereas I'm getting to do all these special projects because they didn't know what else to do with me, and they're like,
Right.
"Well, you already know the content, so go do whatever you want." Like,
Right, right, right.
so,
Yeah, it's wild. And I think too, it's funny because now, looking back, I would act up. I was a class clown because I was bored, right? During a
right.
lot of the time. But then, I just felt like demoralized because no one cared. I'm writing stories. I'm really, I'm reading twice as fast and reading, all this kind of stuff. And here I am now at 50 years old, multi-published fiction author and an English professor, right? After feeling like I was a lousy student and hating
Mhm.
school and not even getting that I was actually not dumb until I got to college, right? And it's just like, oh, wow, this system is not good, right? And I think this is also one of the things that when you start reading about how people learn and how education works and, being intrinsically motivated and all those kind of things, it's like, oh, now I get it, right? Now I get
Mhm.
why I was demoralized and felt bad, and all those kinds of things. And it's just I remember too, I took a psychology class in high school. And I remember that there's one part of this video that we watched because that's what you did in high school, right? Pop in a video. Where they were interviewing a woman and they said, we do all this stuff with math and science testing, but we never look at, say, what if a child is unusually empathetic? Like, why aren't
Mm.
we training?
Sure,
Why aren't
yeah.
we looking for a broad variety of human characteristics and then helping support and promote those things that people are naturally good at? And it's like, with the system that we currently have, what would you even track them into if they were a very empathetic student
Mhm.
at 7 or 8 years old? We have no track for that because that's not an academic thing, right? And it's like, again, we've created this box, and if you don't fit in the box, then we just shove harder until parts start falling off. It's like you're
Well, and I think, I mean, you and I have this characteristic in common. I think, like, both of us are neurodivergent in our own way. And I think whether it's ADHD or being on the autism spectrum, I was very lucky that I was good at school
hmm
because I probably would have struggled a lot more in life if not for the fact that I felt like I had a thing that I was good at, like special at, right? But the problem was the school system, as you said, is not designed to capture the social emotional parts of
yep,
a person's development. It's not designed to capture the engagement element. Like, what is it that engages a particular student? How do you leverage that engagement towards some productive end? It very much, as you said, is it's a square peg round hole situation if you don't fit the model that was prescribed. And I think part of the mentality here, at least among the policymakers or the folks who administrate these systems, is if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
right,
Partly because I think some of them sincerely believe that. Part of it, I think, is the challenge of fixing it is too
too great.
daunting
Yep,
and it's too complicated, right? We talk all the time about the benefits of world modeling and world building for understanding history or for understanding sociopolitics or whatever. There's the world of education too. And I think as soon as you start scratching at the surface of that, you realize much of what we do is actually predicated on what bus schedule is going to make the
yep,
most sense for the number of students we have to move around, or we
right,
have all these students who participate in after school sporting activities. How are we going to make sure that they can get to their away game and get home so that they're not getting back at 1 in the morning, right? There are
right,
all these other practical considerations, and I don't want to diminish those and say they don't matter and that we can just delete the entire system and build it from scratch because it would look very different if we could do that. But one of the challenges we now face collectively as people who work within the system is that we know that it's broken in these fundamental ways and kind of are forced to keep going through the motions. So even if you understand and are trying to innovate in that space, there's a huge risk to doing that.
right,
And that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize about this specific chapter in terms of design is that not only does your design of a curriculum or of a course or of an activity have to be intentional, you kind of need to work from a theoretical framework because of the fact that you're often going to find whatever you're developing running up against these various hurdles or constraints, and you're going to have to adapt. And that
right,
doesn't mean abandoning the project. It doesn't mean
right.
abandoning the thing you're trying to do.
Or
It means
lowering
being
rigor or any of
well,
those
right,
things, right?
exactly. Like, and I think we could have a whole separate conversation about what rigor actually is and how it manifests in a school. Certainly, I think the way we define rigor in the United States is
Yeah,
not the way that you define rigor in, say, Finland, which is a very different school system than the United States. It doesn't necessarily operate the same way in an environment full of standardized testing versus one where there are lots
right,
of ill-defined, open-ended problems. So when you're innovating, you have to be thinking about during the design process what is my actual goal here? What are
Hmm.
the limiting factors I'm going to have to contend with? And what am I going to do to ensure there's enough flexibility built into this framework that I'm going to be able to adapt when or if or when I'm going to have to do it? And
Hmm.
we can do a needs analysis and look at who is our audience and what is the best way for that audience to learn. But even that is going to be subsumed by these other elements of the system that are not necessarily going to bend or break.
Right,
And
right,
we have to figure out, okay, what are the tools available to me within this toolbox that are going to let me asymptotically approach what good education looks like, knowing that I'm not going to be able to there's no forcing mechanism that's going to cause the entire
right.
education system to change.
I think, one of the things too is that we've said this before that so many people do not get any pedagogy in their graduate training, depending on their discipline. The vast majority of them do not. And I remember I had a colleague who thought they wanted to bring a video game into their class, and they said, "Well, you do games and learning, so why don't we go grab a coffee and talk about it?" And I said, "Okay, well, what do you want to do with this?" It's like, "Oh, well, they're kind of checked out, and I thought it would be fun." Like that was the
Hmm.
extent of it. And I said, "Okay, well, that's a terrible reason for bringing a game in." But moving on from there, what are the learning outcomes for the class? And she just looked at me and said, like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, the class has got specific, like, you've got a curriculum. The class fits within the curriculum. And then there are learning outcomes that you have to try and meet or you're trying to meet in the class. And your assignments align with the learning outcomes. So you can say, well, when you're doing this assignment, it's attending to these two or three or whatever. And she just had this look like she had never thought about teaching that way before. And it's like, oh boy, like we need to step back, right? And this is somebody who I consider to be a good friend, and a decent educator or whatever. But the idea that she had never thought about how these individual pieces work was astounding to me. That it's like, oh
Hmm.
wait, if you've got a 15-week class, I don't even understand how you begin teaching a 15-week class if you're not breaking it down week by week, set in, and then individual meeting time by what it is that you want to try and accomplish and build toward
Hmm.
at the end of the semester. So as we're talking here too, and I mean it's one of those things where it may be the case in which we both do this as sort of like a secondary nature thing. We've come at it from different ways. But for people who are listening who are maybe new to this, if you want to move to this model, what does that look like? What does it mean to attend to the whole student, right? You've got whether it's 32 students in a room or 45 or
Hmm.
150. How do you deal with the fact that if you're trying to individualize for every single student, what does that look like?
That's a really good question. And I know I talked a little bit about this with respect to differentiation in a past episode, but one of the things I found very useful, at least as I continued teaching and refining the way that I would approach curriculum development, was to move away from the model where we assume individualized education plans or 504s to a lesser extent, that those things are outliers, that those are only for students who have some specific neurological, behavioral,
And it's a
physical disability.
and it's a deficit too, right? It's
Right, right,
specifically
right.
seen as a deficit.
Exactly. We often talk about IEPs and 504s as if they are deficit driven or if they are about that individual student failing at something or being unable to do something. When in reality, we should be treating every student as if they have an IEP because every single one of them is bringing new information or different information and experiences to the classroom. And as you alluded to earlier, when I would start my systems design class, I would open with the Starbucks cup as my example, and we talk about complex systems and how products are developed and what does it mean for that cup of coffee to end up in my hand. We'd also talk about what does it mean to take different perspectives. And I would point out to my students, as I am a situated cognitivist, that is sort of the theoretical framework that I operate within. I would say to them, even though all 25, 26 of us are in the same room, we are in 25 or 26 different rooms. Even if we had occupied the same temporal spatial boundaries where I'm sitting where you're sitting and we're looking ahead, we're not attending to the same environmental stimuli or details. We're all going to be attending to different things. Essentially, there's infinite information around us all the time. And as a result, every single person who walks through that door is an individualized learner who has individualized needs.
Mm.
My interactions with all of them are going to be completely different because no matter how many times I teach the same content or the same course, every single student that's coming into my classroom is going to have been born in a different era, is going to have been born in a different location, is going to have had different kinds of family dynamics or friend dynamics
Hmm.
or priorities that are driving their behavior and different topics or areas of interest that engage them. And that in and of itself means that I need to be developing a curriculum that speaks across all different people in this sort of universal way. And that sounds in and of itself quite daunting because it makes it sound like, well, I can never have a firm curriculum. How am I going to write learning objectives if every single student learns differently or they all have different interests? That's crazy. How could I possibly do that? And that's the reason why I used to interpret the concept of differentiation as meaning making the hard, medium, and easy levels of the same test or the same activity, when in reality, what it means is creating these ill-defined questions or
Hmm.
ill-defined outcome-driven activities that are going to allow the learners to project themselves into whatever it is that we're doing. Is that scary? A little bit, because it means you're not the center of attention anymore as the
Hmm.
instructor.
It's the
You
one who
aren't
holds
the
all of the knowledge, right? This
well,
is the
exactly, right? Like the old saw that they are just vessels waiting to be filled with the information that you have to share with them or impart upon them, or that they're coming in tabula rasa and it's your job to fill up those little chalkboards with all the information they're going to need to be successful historians or biologists or chemists or whatever. That's fundamentally flawed. Like that perspective doesn't make sense. And I would add too, a lot of the teacher education programs that exist across the United States maybe they talk about differentiation, they may talk about intersectionality and interdisciplinarity, but there are a lot of teachers who go into the realm of teaching who believe that learning styles means I need to teach the same concept with some auditory element or verbal element, some visual element, and some kinesthetic element. And that's miraculously going to make sure that
yeah.
all of my students understand the content. And in reality, that is a wild distortion of what the literature on learning styles is. And for all intents and purposes, we should behave as if there is no such thing. There's a difference between being a good educator and a not so good educator, no matter how many different ways you split or differentiate your content in terms of visual, auditory, and
Right.
kinesthetic learning, that there is such a thing as crappy kinesthetic learning and high quality kinesthetic learning. And it doesn't mean that somebody who is a quote unquote auditory learner or a quote unquote visual learner that they have to learn through those mechanisms. It's just more like learning preferences.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
something like you were saying about the great lectures. Like I like you, I enjoy listening to lecture. I find it stimulating. I often will have to accelerate the playback speed because my brain will go faster than the lecture itself, and I'll start asking myself these questions. And
I do
like,
the same thing.
not
Yep.
everybody, yeah, not everybody does that. I mean, I think that speaks to our ADHD, but it's a function that not everybody participates in quite the same way. And as a result, the best thing you can do as an educator is to make sure that when you are offering opportunities for your learners to engage with concepts, you're giving them lots of different on-ramps to that content. It's not
Hmm.
the only visual, only auditory, only kinesthetic. It's not that some activities are one of those and not the others. Really, what we're arguing for is an intentional design of a classroom environment where no matter what the content is you're trying to teach, that the learner can decide for themselves. It goes back to what you're saying about agency. The learner can decide for themselves what is the best way to tackle this and apply it in my own life in some way that is sensible to me. It
Hmm.
drives at that question of why am I learning this? Why do I need to know this? Why am I taking this gen ed? It's not because I told you so. It's because there's an opportunity here for you to understand some different aspect of the world and how it's constructed and how it operates. And that what I want for you to do is to fit that concept or idea into your life experience or into your
Hmm.
life world and have that direct your behavior or attention in some way that it might not have been directed had you not taken this class.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of the whole point of the humanities, right? Like
Right, right, right.
it's
Well, that's one of the things too. It's funny because as you're talking, and I'm thinking, okay, the title of the book has world modeling, simulation, and play, meaning specifically role play, and it seems like in some cases you may do a lot of world modeling and neither of the others. Some you may do very little of one, and you do a lot of role play or something like that. But it reminded me as you were talking about, I went to this. I was invited to conduct a workshop at a different university, and I was dealing with I gave a talk on world building, gave a little talk on simulation and role play. Didn't get too far down the line. And he said, "Oh well, I'm an engineer, and my engineering students are bad." And I think he used the term soft skills or something like that, right?
Mhm.
And they resist taking humanities classes and liberal arts or whatever. And we were talking, and he's like, they just don't understand why it would be why it's necessary. And I said, okay, well maybe world modeling isn't going to be the most important thing, but you're going to be working in an environment, even you're an engineer, where there's probably going to be some other client or some other member of your team, right? And maybe somebody on your team is going through a divorce. Maybe somebody has a substance abuse issue,
Mhm.
maybe you're like whatever. Like these are the human things that you run into no matter how much you want to clearly delineate the engineering problem. There is no way you escape the human side of all of this.
Hmm.
And this is exactly what we do in the humanities and the liberal arts, is try and understand, well, why is this person being difficult today? Or, they don't seem to be listening or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, well, there could be lots of different reasons, but being able to have that ability to think through different people's perspectives, to maybe not make, gross generalizations or assumptions about somebody else, but there are valid reasons as to why people may be acting in the way that they are. And at the end of the day, you still got to get your project done, right? So having
Right.
some exposure to that, having some sensitivity to that, and understanding that you can never escape it completely, I think is an important lesson in and of itself. And I was thinking too, like even in this 150 student class where they're sitting at tables of 5 or 6, we did a quick world building exercise where I generated, this fake nation that had 5 or 6 different cities that had different, one was like a Palm Springs kind of retirement thing, another one was the big urban multi-diverse kind of thing or whatever. And I passed those around so every table got a different city. Every person got a different character that they had to think about, and they were different across age, race, religion, all these kind of different things. And then I gave them a bunch of different types of questions, like, you want taxes. Somebody's proposing taxes go up because for whatever, to improve the public schools or whatever. And the question then was, and then there was another one about like they're going to really double down on community policing and ratting out your neighbors if you think there's something going on. And their job was to look at their character and try and formulate how they would vote on these referendums, and then be able to explain to everybody else what was it from the character sheet that they were using, that they were basing. Why would this person feel like this? Well, it's because this grandparent doesn't care about public schools or whatever, right? And this was a case in which it was designed in a way that I didn't need to go around to every single table and make the point. See, there isn't a right or wrong answer to this. Different people will come to their own conclusion for different reasons.
Hmm.
I sort of did a quick postmortem at the end, and that allowed everybody to say, like, oh, well, my grandparents are really about public schools, so they would vote for it, even if they don't, whatever. So they have those conversations, they can share experiences, they can role play through a different perspective, and that didn't require me to have them each write a personal essay or something like that, because the point of that particular lesson is there are no right or wrong answers in the way
Hmm.
there is. I know the class that was right before me was a physics class, right? And there it's all about how do you get to the right answer, right? Like how do you apply the formula, whatever. And there is a right answer, and the question is how do you get to it, as efficiently as possible. Well, what we're doing is not like that at all. There is no right answer as to whether the taxes should go up to support public schools. There are reasons why people would think that, and there are reasons why people would be against that. But there is no right or wrong. It depends on your perspective. So that's just one kind of example of a way that you could bring in a specific topic or a specific assignment that you would allow students to actually face each other, talk to each other, learn from each other, right? And then the last thing too, because we're over an hour here, so I want to watch this. But I think one of the things too that you've mentioned, and I've watched a presentation where it was the first time I heard this, a time for telling, right? Which is where the people who
Hmm.
do like the didactic stuff, who do like us, do like lectures. Can you talk a little bit about the theory of the time for telling and how that fits into all this?
Yeah, so there's this article by Dan Schwartz and John Bransford called A Time for Telling, and the entire premise of that article is that it's not to diminish lecture and not to diminish the value of some sort of didactic relationship between the instructor and the learner. It's to organize learning such that the learner has some intentionality when they get to the lecture. We talk in the beginning of chapter 3 all about transferability and what is transfer and why is it so difficult to measure. And we give the example of Gick and Holyoake's study that looks at really the unlikelihood that somebody's going to spontaneously transfer learning from one environment to another. Schwartz and Bransford were suggesting that just giving people the information in a textbook is not sufficient to get them to understand a concept or to apply it outside the classroom. But what you can do is set them up or prime them such that they know what to listen for and attend to when it comes time to do lecture. My colleague Mike Young and I frequently would invoke this example where you're teaching somebody to fly an F-16 fighter jet or something, and you hand them the instruction manual, which is probably 30 volumes long of several hundred pages each, and it has the explanation of what every button in the cockpit's going to do. You wouldn't just hand that to somebody and then put them in this multi-billion-dollar vehicle and say, have at it, right? And in fact, I think there's a really nice visualization of this in the most recent season of The Rehearsal with Nathan Fielder, who is trying to figure out how do I train pilots to be better pilots? And it's partly live action role play. You get them in there, they're pretending they're in this specific role or mentality and they're acting it out. it's also thinking through what do they need to know to ask the good questions to be
Hmm.
able to role play effectively or to be able to position themselves effectively to then hear the thing you've got to say. So we frequently in the realm of instructional design will invoke sexual harassment training or diversity training, whatever it is that we have to do sort of on this annual compliance basis. There's a lot of literature that demonstrates that the vast majority of people who go through those compliance trainings are not very good at recognizing actual real world examples of that stuff happening. So, yeah, you might sit through the half hour, lecture telling you don't sexually harass the people you work with, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to apply that knowledge when it would be relevant because
Hmm.
in your real life, there are all these other contextual dependencies that are going to drive your behavior and thinking that just don't exist in that very impoverished setting
Right,
of
right.
the lecture you're getting. And one of the things that I would argue, again, as sort of a situated cognitivist, is if you want any of this to be successful, and this is really what Schwartz and Bransford were driving at, you need to think about what can I do to make the learning as richly authentic as possible. And that might be constrained by safety concerns. It might be constrained by resources or money. It might be constrained by all manner of different kinds of things. But when you're designing a lesson or when you're designing a program of study, you want to be thinking about how can I position the learner such that they're getting a good idea of what a real world case would look like for applying this knowledge or skill. And then how am I going to convert that experience into something that could effectively help them attend to those differences at points where it's going to be meaningful for whatever real world outcome we want. So
Hmm.
in the chapter, we talk about Chernobyl and the relationship between the book about Chernobyl versus the HBO series Chernobyl versus the game Fallout 3, which is all about a post-apocalyptic nuclear society. We want to give multiple cases to the learner and ask them to participate in those environments so they can ask good questions of one another and then be primed for the lecture that the lecturer needs to give. And
Hmm.
to your example of the multiple students at a table, each deconstructing a city or trying to justify why would a particular character behave in such and such a way, that's a good example of what Schwartz and Bransford are talking about, that you give them the opportunity to interrogate that from their own perspective in this sort of holistic way where they're projecting themselves into that environment.
Hmm.
And then you're regrouping everybody to
Right.
say, okay, what did group one learn? What did group two learn? How
Yeah.
did you differentiate those two examples from one another? What did we miss that somebody else might have been able to observe? And we'll talk more about this when we get to the next chapter on communities of practice. But what I would love for the audience of this podcast to take away is as you're designing your curriculum, thinking about your audience not as one block of people,
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
consistent block, but to instead think about it as a dynamic, flexible system in which multiple different nodes contain different kinds of information, different skills, and that when they are all together, you as sort of the metaphorical orchestra conductor who's looking at all the different instruments, all the different parts, all the different sections, that you are trying to synthesize them into something greater than their sum. It is always going to be different when you have a new group of students because, as I was saying earlier, each one is an individual. Each one has their
Hmm.
own individualized education plan for all intents and purposes. And you need to construct something that, yes, follows learning objectives that are consistent across all instantiations of that class, but that the activities are not centered on the performance of some specific outcome that is visual, auditory, or
Yeah.
kinesthetic,
Yeah.
but
Right.
instead creates opportunities for the student or the learner to exert agency and project themselves onto that content in a way that is going to be obvious to them as to how it would transfer back into their life outside of the classroom.
Yeah. And I
Does that
think
kind
the,
of answer your question,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Ethan?
I mean, I knew what the answer was going to be, but I needed you to say it for the purposes of this podcast. We'll talk about this more when we get to the episode on assessment. But one of the things that I have also found to be really, really great is when instead of asking like what were the criteria leading up to the start of World War I or whatever, and write me an essay on that, is just asking students, what did you learn in this class? What did you learn in
Hmm.
this semester, right? And you find that generally, hopefully they've learned what you were hoping that they would learn. But what I found by doing that is there is so much rich stuff that I had not accounted for because of their personal
Yep.
experiences, because, oh, my grandfather was here, and told me this story or whatever. And I had no way of knowing that, right? So it's getting away from that idea that this knowledge that we have or that we're providing, or whatever to the students is sort of like this uniform block that we just sort of hand to them, as opposed to like you've got to figure out for yourself what this means, and
Hmm.
kind of encouraging them to do that. And is the minute that they can start to see why it would be relevant, I think is the minute then it's like, oh, well, wait a minute. If I'm the one, rather than you judging me, if I'm the one who needs to bring something to this, that changes the dynamic completely, right? And I think the earlier that we can do that for students is to be like, hey, look, this class has content, but it's up to you to bring you to the table, right? And that's going to be
Hmm.
important. I think that changes the whole dynamic. And then why would you not want to be involved, right? Like why would you be like, no, I don't want this class. I don't want to be involved with myself in this class whatsoever, right? That seems like a thing that people would not want to do unless they just want to kind of just purely go through the motions. But one of the things too that you'd said earlier, I can't remember whether there's an earlier episode earlier in this conversation or whatever, is that as an instructor, you really need to be thinking, why am I doing this thing right
Hmm.
now in this moment, right? Like, what am I trying to accomplish? And this is where, too, if you're teaching a class, like I remember when I was teaching intro to college composition and research writing, right? And the students there, they were compulsory. Students generally didn't want to be there. And at that time, I didn't want to be there either because I wanted to be teaching creative writing. But, as I got a little bit more experience, one of the things that I started doing was requiring them, especially in the research writing, is they needed to come up with their own topic. I would not give them a topic. I would not even give them suggestions for topics. They needed to find something that they were curious about. And it was really interesting for me because it was so hard for so many of them to come up with
Hmm.
any idea. And or they'd come up with ideas like, well, I'm gonna write on why cell phones are bad and no one should be using them. I'm like, okay, well, I use a cell phone. You use a cell phone. Well, I just thought that would be like an interesting. Well, do you believe that? Well, no. Well, then why would you want to write a paper on it, right? But it's because they had been sort of conditioned to
Hmm.
give the teacher whatever it was that they thought that they wanted or whatever. And as soon as you turn that corner and it's like, oh, well, pick a topic, and that can be really, really hard to become that sort of authentic learner who is going after the things that you're most interested in. That's a real challenge for a lot of students because they have not had at university level or at any level because they have not had that expectation. The expectation is conformity. You will do the same
Hmm.
things as everybody else. We will grade you on an objective scale that says whether you're really smart, not that smart, whatever. And the idea that life does not actually work like that, nor does it work within neatly siloed disciplines. It doesn't work like none of it works anything like that at all. And we just expect everything to magically transfer is just like insanity, right? Like I guess when I put it that way, it sounds even crazier that this is the way that we expect to educate people. But anyway, maybe that's the right way to end this episode. It's
Yeah,
insane.
I actually think that's a great segue into what we'll be doing next time. So the next chapter is all about communities of practice, and we're going to talk about what does it mean to center the learners as opposed to yourself as the instructor. We're also going to focus on what does it mean to be a co-learner among the learners? What is it that self-organizes these kinds of groups, and what does it mean to co-construct knowledge broadly? What does it mean in a world building context to co-construct knowledge? So coming attractions. We'll
Yep.
focus more on that next time. And thank you all for listening. Thanks for you, Trent, being here, and
Yep. And
thanks for getting through a second recording.
right, recording this correctly this time. Yeah, so I'm excited to keep the conversation going. It's always easy to have a conversation with you, pal. Talk to you next episode.
Yeah, we'll see
Bye.
you all next time.
The World Building Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The World Building Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.